Hello everybody. Thank you for coming and welcome to the second panel in today's IET media-led set of panels. As Ian introduced earlier, IET Media is a section of the IET in the UK, and we are focused very much on the whole media landscape. And so we've just had a presentation, a panel on the distribution and almost business side of broadcast. And now we're going to have a little look at the contribution side in terms of, that's going IP, and what does that mean, and how are people doing that differently. So, as an industry, there's a strong adoption of IP, and that's been going for a long time. It started off in the cloud when that was just a word and people were trying to work out what it meant. And now that's almost commoditized in terms of distribution. People assume things are in the cloud, and then when they're not, they're surprised. But in the contribution side of things, it's a little bit different. We still have a loss of older non-IP kit, and people are realizing more and more that there's big benefits in moving to IP. But again, it's one of those words, it's just a word until we give it meaning. And there's different ways of giving IP meaning, and we've got two of them that we're talking about today. So in general terms, we have ways of making cameras work and interoperating with vision mixers and other equipment in IP. And today we'll talk about NDI, which is a technology for doing that really quickly and with very slight compression. And there's another technology by SMPTE. It's a standard, which is a set of standards indeed about how to transport uncompressed video, audio and other data from one place to another. How do you route that within your facility? How do you make that work for you? So that explains how to do it. And we have a whole section at IBC called the IP Showcase that talks about that. The question really is we've got two different types of technologies which fulfill different needs, and we want to talk a little bit about that. And to help me explore the topic, we've got EBU's Willem Vermost at the end. Willem, would you like to just introduce yourself for a couple of moments?
Willem. So my name is Willem Vermost. I work for EBU now for 4 years, and I started there after working for a public broadcaster in Belgium. I started off working in broadcast technology in '99. Then I discovered pretty soon that everything was moving to IP. So I went back to university and did some studies on informatics. So I have electronics, informatics, and that was an excellent combination when I saw the discussion popping up of having a live IP, your broadcast facility, even the live streams on IP. So I thought this is the moment to move to EBU, and this is where I got introduced into 2110 and all the flavors around it. Mm-hmm. So that's me.
We also have Marc Risby from the Group CTO of Boxer and Digibox from the UK.
Hi. Hi. I'm CTO at Boxer. I've been there about 25 years, and we're a UK-based company. We often bring in American products from the US and distribute them and sell them in Europe, in the UK and Europe. A lot of what I've been doing over the past, at least the past 15, 20 years has been really bringing computers and television together, computers and video together. So from file-based and now up to IP. So my role at the minute is often involved in sort of evangelizing IP in general, and also being involved a lot in the POCs and the initial installations with both actually 2110 and NDI. So hopefully I've got a little bit of experience on both sides.
And we also have Will Waters from NDI. Since there's been a rebrand and a change, we've got a couple of slides just to make that clear. Yeah. You want to pop up and take us through those?
Yeah, Will Waters, and we're here representing VizRT Group, which is just newly announced. It's bringing about together, as you see here, more stories better told. And what that's all about is taking three really strong brands that have been known in the industry and bringing that into a full presence. So, of course, VizRT with the amazing products from a visual storytelling standpoint. Newtek bringing along that software-driven, or what we call software-defined software-defined visual storytelling and integrated systems, and of course the NDI protocol, which we'll talk about here today, which allows that as a separate brand, bringing that out as a transport mechanism and a way to really bring about what we're trying to do here with the move to IP, which is deliver more flexibility and of course get more content in more places, doing that on viewer demand, and of course staying within a budget. So just a quick history, I guess, back on what NDI is, just for those that don't know. We actually launched it here, or Newtek launched it in IBC of 2015 as a protocol. Of course, it's been in development for 10 years prior to that with the software products that Newtek was developing. Earlier in the year, over 12,000 downloads of the SDK in that time period of that 4 years, with thousands of companies actually adding NDI to their products. But a big thing today is that there is a large IP video production ecosystem, but we also just this morning delivered the NDI 4.0 SDK, which brings about all kinds of other features, enhancements, including a mobile app for iOS to really push forward the idea of what IP can do and bringing that together. As far as who I am, I'm Vice President of Customer Success on the Newtek brand, and it's my responsibility to make sure that our services runs, our support runs, make sure that customers are able to get what they can get out and utilize in an IP world. So broadcast engineering is a background, but I'm happy here to have a conversation with IP.
Cool. That's great. Thank you. And so just to start with you then, I mean, there's been a large uptake in NDI in certain industries and parts of the media spectrum. How would you talk about the split? We know that esports are a big user of NDI and versus broadcast versus...
Well, really, the fantastic thing is it really comes across so many different industries and industry types. Wherever you have a network, wherever you have a story that needs to be told, you have an opportunity for some type of transport, and NDI really has found a foothold there. So esports is a big user because that is one particular area where the original content is done in software. So if we look at the fact that there's software, there's computers, and there's networks, how do you get each one of those particular sources to a place? Like, do we narrow things down to try and pass it through a particular transport mechanism? Well, it's easy when you have software that's actually creating the world. You need to move that over into switching into the storytelling, into being able to record that. You put that all together, so that's one area. Another is corporate video, because content that you see and you have here, there's a lot of content being generated in many different places, and the ubiquity of the network allows for something like NDI to really take a foothold because it's easy to develop on, and it's the most important thing is it can operate on a gigabit network in many cases.
Yeah. So Marc, what are you seeing in terms of customers that you work with, and what are they asking for? What are their needs?
So I'd echo that. We've got customers in lots of spaces. Touching again on the esports, we saw some instant advantages that made them go NDI. For a start, you don't need a scan converter on every computer. Now that doesn't sound like much, but if I've got 20 computers, that's 20 scan converters I need to get it into my infrastructure. So it's a massive saving, much more flexible if you can run it as software driver on that machine. So that was a case of actually NDI making a market that wasn't really there before. It was a new place for it. The corporate guys and the high-end sort of enterprise people, they don't even question it. I want a system, I want it to be flexible, I want it to be well priced. NDI fits in. They don't ask for NDI, they don't ask for 2110, but they don't ask for SDI, they just want a system. Now broadcasters, that's a bit different. We've got people who are doing POCs, we've got people who are doing islands, we've got people who are doing full-scale refreshes and planning for where they're going to be in a few years' time. And they're all in different places. Broadcasters, by and large, the tier one guys, the high-end people, are quite risk adverse and cautious, and so they tend to be looking for security. But a lot of them are really happy to put in an island. So we've got a lot of NDI working in small work groups, regions, for example. It may be on their web team or the radio team, the social media guys, or in specific events. Again, went very quickly. They weren't worried about an overall plan. They were happy that this was a point solution, and NDI gave them a ton of flexibility. Some of the others are really still quite slow, sitting on the fence, and that's an IP thing in general. They know the direction they want to go is IP. They're just not sure when to jump and when is the right time.
And Willem, you're obviously talking to lots of public broadcasters. They've got big infrastructure projects coming up as well, so they have, I guess, different requirements.
Well, let's say that it's indeed not an A or a B or a black and a white story. So let's get this off the table.
Yeah.
And it's not about, well, they want to go IP to go IP. We have about 32 members throughout Europe and a big one in Canada, CBC. And they don't have the luxury to think when they are going to replace their infrastructure, because they need to build a new building. And when you build a new facility, then the first question is, well, what technology will we put in? And one of the, I guess it's CBC that had a nice quote saying, well, will we be the last one using SDI or probably the first one on IP? And given the scale that they have, well, they're looking for something open and interoperable. But it's not only 2110, right? They're looking into smaller solutions that they can quickly pop up left and right. So I think a big discussion popping up is how we interoperate all these things. How we come from the islands that pop up to a full facility that's interconnected. So those are questions that we want to look into.
Yeah, and so you're working on JTNM on interoperability for 2110.
Yeah, there's maybe another thing that people need to see as well. If you talk about NDI, that's, well, the video transport, but it's all the connection management on top as well. If you say 2110, you just have the data plane. So you need to have the control plane as well. And the control plane that's usually referred to as AMWA NMOS specifications. So those go together if you want to build something that works.
Yeah. So, I mean, that comes down to ease of use as well. There's practical sides of it in terms of implementing a new facility, but actually people need it to be easy to use. And I guess that's one aspect where it was always built into NDI from the beginning. Is that right, in terms of its video and audio?
Yeah. Absolutely, I think that's an important thing. I mean, the standards that are brought about with 2110 deliver that for interoperability, and really kind of looking at a holistic approach of how we take not only that transport, but as you said, the control, the metadata, be able to do that route, have those FSs together. Of course, keep that all in time. Looking at that from a standpoint, but let's be practical about where we are and what how the economics work. If you need development, you need that new tool. You have consumers that are moving, watching in different areas. It may be mobile. It may be a new production type or new storytelling type. You need those developers who can quickly and easily put something together that can basically feed that content piece. That's where NDI really has a strength, because there's a very easy to develop on SDK that has all that framework to be able to put that together. It was originally designed and intended in software, which is an important aspect, and it allows that innovation, the development that may happen on an individual, that where they don't have access to a facility or a greenfield environment where there's a full 2110 environment that they can work on. So they need to be able to operate and develop on the tools at hand. And that brings about innovation across the board, whether, whatever your transport mechanism, it gets us into the flexibility of what IP was originally intended, which is open interoperability and communication.
And there are NDI to 2110 converters, aren't there?
Oh yes, of course. I mean, just like I know that Boxer has seen it and already used this in different areas about being able to bring that from those islands and then basically interface that on a larger scale. So it really runs across the board. I think it's important to know that the move here is into IP. And it's not necessarily about even the transport mechanism at all. It's about what we're going to get to by doing this, which is, you call virtualization. That's a buzzword that's heard all the time. But it's really about having that flexibility that you can do the production, you can get that contribution when you need it, where you need it, and do that in an economical way that's practical for your business. That's what this entire move is all about.
And so the approach seems to be quite different in terms of the interoperability, where you're taking responsibility as a company for everybody being interoperable because it's the same code that they're running?
Yes, I mean, from a philosophical standpoint, it's really important. You can say, well, this is proprietary, it's kind of a black box, what are you doing with that? I mean, that's where the benefit of a standard committee, like what SMPTE is doing with 2110, it allows for multiple companies to develop on an open standard that everybody knows and is aware of. Again, when you come back to like time to market though, like and how you're going to bring something to be able to work with customers, you need to have that control plane that goes on top of that. And Newtek now with the separate NDI brand that there is a responsibility that's being able to allow for that development to happen in a very quick and agile way and in response to market demands.
Well, completely. No, one of the things that when I talk to broadcasters, one of the things they say, well, it's a huge investment, right? If you have to build your facility from scratch and build in all the new boxes, cameras, vision mixer, and that sort of things, well, they want to be sure that their investment is worthwhile on the long run and that they can go with the scale. So one of the things that, well, you can love and hate 2110, but one of the things is, well, there's a document and you know all the ins and the outs. So you can predict the scalability a little bit, and that's maybe something that they're afraid of, to go NDI, because they're not sure how scalable it is and that sort of thing.
But I think
probably it is.
What we've seen in there, though, you could say, even though it's a standard, how many times have we talked about interoperability and workshops and how we're proving in plug fests that different IP and 2110 standards work together? I've not had to go to an NDI workshop and an NDI plug fest. Everything I've ever got that's NDI plugs together and works because they're using the same core. One of the problems with 2110 is you've got 27 people from different companies making and fighting over that standard and about how they want it to be.
Well,
so it's anything but agile.
Well, that's quite nice, because we do have these JTNM tested events that we run a few weeks ago, and we had 73 different products, and actually they run quite nicely together. There are some, well, in the UHD space, we might think about, we only saw 5 or 7 products, so that's not a lot.
No.
But HD is getting there pretty well. So that's
but it's a lot better defined now. I think that's one of the things a lot of people have missed. A lot of people's understanding of 2110 goes back to 2022-6 or whatever in the early stages. We've come on 2 years since then, and we have got standards, and stuff does actually pretty much work together. There's many other challenges, but the baseline operability, that pretty much is there now with 2110.
Yeah, and I guess if you are putting in a new facility, there's going to be a lot of streams, audio and video, and you're going to have a relatively big and arguably complex network infrastructure. When you come to do maintenance, and when you come to find out why something went off air, you really need to be able to dig in and know exactly which path was being taken at which point. So I guess that 2110 perhaps allows a little bit more, control at scale. Would you say that would be true? In terms of being able to, take certain parts of the network off air or route your traffic elsewhere.
Well, you need to be very much aware of the network. You mentioned it's compressed NDI. There's now a compressed version of 2110 as well, but the main part, the -20, it's uncompressed.
Yeah.
So it's a huge bandwidth, and many broadcasters still want to have uncompressed for whatever application. It's a huge deal of bandwidth, and it's running at such a rate that you need to be sure what it does on your network. It's like having a traffic. If you have multiple cars on multiple lanes and you want to go to a smaller lane, in network land you start using the buffer in the switch. Of course, buffers are limited, so that's why there's something called traffic shaping document, the -21, that really describes how well you should behave on the network. And doing this, we're quite sure that it's reliable as well. So that's quite nice.
Yep. I guess the requirements for different broadcasts and everybody's requirements are different, but particularly in the public broadcast sector, I imagine there's a big emphasis on quality, and that drives a wish for uncompressed video. Do you think that, when they come in to put in their best 2 or 3 studios and buying massive, really expensive cameras, do you think that that's still a driver, I guess, in terms of what that infrastructure is going to be?
I think one of the biggest drivers, I learned this in, let's say 4 years ago, we did a VRT proof of concept that was in Belgium. And one of the things we said, no, we need to have shareability. And this is why the dream about virtualization comes in as well. You want to have the central CPU power somewhere in the central basement and you want to share it. Maybe day one your studio X is going to need multiple cameras, multiple switching power, CPU power, and the other one maybe less. And instead of driving around, I remember those days when I was driving around Betacams because they were expensive, and some point you needed to have 4 of them in Studio 1 and 5 of them in the other one, and you needed to pull them out, drive them over. So with IP, we get to the flexibility, having everything central in a rack and share the resources whenever you want. So I think the discussion is even not about what type of transport, is it NDI or is it 2110? That's probably not the discussion. The discussion is probably also not the control plane. The discussion will be the resource planning plane. Because we need to be able to share those resources and not just take resources when maybe somebody else is using it. So there's probably the next level that we need to go.
I think that's missing from both sides in a way. One of the things we've been really spoiled in broadcast over the years. If I've got a 256 squared SDI router and I do a route from one source to another, I've got the bandwidth. I've always got the bandwidth. If we've got a blocking network where we have different switches in different places and we've got different bandwidths connecting those switches together and different pipelines in there, how do I visualize that? How do I know that I've booked that resource to go from here to here? And how do I know it will be available when I need it in 10 minutes time? And that's something that we haven't quite got, I don't think, as an industry yet. We haven't got to that point where we're visualizing that in a way that an operator can use. And we don't have infinite budget, which is the other thing. I'm finding that there's a lot of broadcasters now who I would have said in the past would only have considered an uncompressed solution, who are very happy to look at NDI because, let's face it, uncompressed 2110 requires huge switch infrastructure and network infrastructure. They're carrier grade switches. They're not something you buy off the shelf. So we've actually replaced a proprietary switch with a really expensive IP switch, and the management that goes along with that, the reskilling and all of the other things we need from people to set it up. So actually there's a certain group of people who've actually looked at something like an NDI, and I'm sure with the compressed standards with 2110, people are going to find that much easier to manage. All of a sudden, if we can get 4K like UHD down below a 12 gig bearer into a sub 10 gig port, that makes our economics change significantly. And as I say, I don't have a single broadcaster who tells me they want to spend more on their infrastructure. Everyone seems to want to spend less. Yeah.
Well, I think that to add to that goes along with what that resource management planning would have to be. You really need the ability to make what you have available work to you with the resources at hand. Again, the content that is being demanded from anybody that is in the contribution, it just increases. It's going up and up and up. And to be able to work through that in an economic way where you're always uncompressed or you always have dedicated resources that are sitting in one particular show but yet not available when you need to basically move to where the viewer is. Because let's be honest, we're all in video here, we're all working that. It's all about where the viewers are following. Mm-hmm. So what this allows you to do is actually move into that where your business as from an infrastructure standpoint can kind of follow along and deal with that. So yeah, we'll have some compressed opportunities to be able to manage that in a way where let me squeeze this out because I have a new show I need to put in, or it's going to be 3 months before I'm available to get into that new control room, or maybe even we're not talking about control rooms, we're actually breaking that apart and utilizing cloud-based infrastructure and the best teams and the best people. There's not just resource standpoint, but there's also a human, so flying people around, getting them in a truck, that's expensive. When we really get into that IP world and have all that together, that speed of light becomes, but a really important point.
That's a good point. It touched on what you said earlier on as well. I think sometimes we keep over concentrating on the infrastructure and the technology, mm-hmm. and our customers actually care about the application. So what I have is people coming to me saying, how do I make my production cheaper? How do I make this a remote production where I can switch it back at base rather than ship a truck? That's what they want to talk about. How do I do that? They don't say, how do I do that using 2110-20? How do I do that using NDI? They don't actually care. They want to know, will it fulfill this requirement? They want to know, I'm doing dog racing or horse racing. How do I make sure that picture from that track gets back to, that's the kind of language people are using. And then it's up to us almost to prove that our technologies will fit the use case. And I think that's the right way round to doing it. Otherwise, it's the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, and I heard a lot of discussions about, no, it has to be super low latency. Well, then you go probably uncompressed or go whatever codec that delivers you this. But most of the things, do we really need low latency? I'm not sure.
No.
I heard somewhere a case about horse betting, but that's probably not everywhere.
There are certainly certain parts of it, like I've done some betting work where the latency is super low just to make sure you can't, accidentally put a bet on a horse that's already run a race.
Tell me where.
But a lot of other things, they're more worried, for example, how the vision mixer reacts. So as long as all the signals arrive at the vision mixer at the same time, the latency actually isn't that important because the output is what's important from the other end of it. So,
but that's hard to grasp for people.
It is, yeah,
because
absolutely.
They've been used to something that you actually don't need. It's like at a certain moment in time we had a discussion about clean switching. Now, where do you need clean switching?
Yeah. Well, also compression. Compression's the same as well. I find that people say
once it's produced, it's compressed.
It's compressed, right? And so you say, well, I must have an uncompressed infrastructure. And you say, well, you're shooting in a compressed format, you're editing in a compressed format, you're transmitting in a compressed format. Why does that piece of infrastructure need to be uncompressed? It doesn't make sense.
It always depends on the use case a little bit. So the more flexible you want to be with your use cases, well, the more high-end you end up.
Yeah.
But if you know up front, well, that's never going to be part of my use cases, then, well, you know where to aim for your infrastructure as well.
Well, if you're a service provider and I don't know which broadcaster is going to be using my kit at any point, uncompressed makes my life easy. I know that everything I've got in my chain is uncompressed, so everything will handle everything, and then I cut it up accordingly. But there's a price to be paid for that flexibility, and it's just whether or not you've...
That inefficiency, I mean, you're tying up cash in the infrastructure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But that's what I'm saying. You have to have, that's going to cost you, and if you don't know if your next customer wants uncompressed and you're a service provider,
you have that,
but say no.
But I mean, even if you have that for peak standpoints from that service provision, if you divvy that up, it's like one of the, okay, do I sell 10 at €100 versus 50, 60 or 50, 60 at €1,000. I mean, it's just it's the economy of scale that comes along with it.
In terms of NDI's ability to scale, I mean, obviously there are kind of big events put together in NDI. Do you have a sense of explaining how it scales up?
Well, I mean, from a scaling standpoint, a lot of it has to do with the planning, and then, of course, the infrastructure that goes along with it. I mean, being that you're on the network, you're looking at bandwidth, you're looking at time for hops, the jitter that may be on the network, all the different traffic that goes in and shaping. Like, there's a performance media network that has to be there, but. As far as scalability goes, I mean, we have customers that are utilizing hundreds of sources around a facility. Some have moved up in nearing that 1,000 mark. Now that's a little bit different than like I think what the CBC is doing in Canada, where I mean they're dealing with thousands of sources in a different place, and so they have to do that planning out in the greenfield. But the thing about NDI is yes, it can scale. It's about the practicalities of that. The NDI has brought about a lot of productions that, frankly, in the traditional method would never have existed. So bringing that together, and then really with the agility of the software development, you can kind of add on that and grow as necessary.
Just to chip in another example, I've been visiting a member last week, and they had the example of having a kid show. And kid shows, well, usually they don't get a lot of money. And they said, well, we have those presenters and they're electing new presenters for the show, and they have to run a trajectory throughout the forest and whatever. And they said, well, we need to do something innovative here. So they pull a network through the forest. They put some cheap cameras that they buy, just webcams. They convert it to NDI as well. And then they run the complete production in parallel with the SDI production. And they see if it matches and makes sense. They can get those materials back into the production. And this is where it's really interesting, because in 4 weeks' time, there's the ID and there's the solution.
So I saw a video of behind the scenes at a production esports, and the whole gallery looks exactly like you would see in a broadcast gallery. So, to me, it feels like, where it makes sense, and I guess that's the question. There's no reason why that you can't do production in something that's quick to set up and like NDI, and then pass that on into the main infrastructure.
We've done some esports applications, and that's absolutely right. I mean, esports has changed. If there's still a lot of people who haven't really looked closely at esport. It's not a toy. It's not a game. Sounds an odd thing, but literally is a game. But these guys are running it like any sports broadcaster. Some of them started on a shoestring, but the big guys now are running EVS playback. They're playing it back as if it's a real car race or a real soccer game or whatever it is, because that's the way that people are consuming it and viewing it. So at that point, if you use an IP-based system to simplify your front of house stuff, if you like, it doesn't matter how you hand it off. At the end of the day, your production products are still exactly as they were. I mean, I've just been working with somebody on a reality project that's not quite happened. The previous project they used a lot of PTZ kind of cameras around the building, but they were running them over video. And they were explaining how this house, they'd knocked holes in the walls and how much stuff they had to move things around. And I sat there with them and drew it up how we would do it now with IP. Happened to be NDI, this particular example, but it would have worked either way. So I'm saying, how many cameras do you need per room? And we need 5 cameras per room. And I said, well, you could run those off of one little, in this case, little gig switch, would run all those to there, and we run one cable back or one fiber back from there to the control room. It was really easy. We can get these aggregation points that make their wiring and their infrastructure really, really simple. And that's the kind of thing that made a difference. You could see this guy's light up just thinking at how much easier their installation would be based around architecting it in a way that they hadn't done before. And I can tell you now, I think we've shipped somewhere in the region of 1,000 gateways to allow people to connect a normal camera to NDI. So I know there's 1,000 channels out there running NDI in Europe of just the stuff we've moved alone. Yeah. Right? So, there's a lot of people saying, well, no one's really doing IP. There are a lot of people doing IP.
A lot of it. I want to say that it's not just the transport mechanisms that you get with it. I mean, going back to the esports situation, in broadcast, we have these set of standards that have been around for so long that, that we're used to how to get that moving picture on that rectangle, right? The thing is, when you get into something like esports, you have games that don't necessarily, abide by those particular standards. What do you do when you have a very popular player who's used to running their game at 144 hertz? Like, okay, now I have a real problem when I want to tell a story around that through a traditional infrastructure, because I have to do a conversion. Oh, their particular, how do you scan convert that? How do you get that graphics card to work with? Well, something like NDI being able to be developed in software that can run right in that GPU code, you can, we have done this, have the ability to basically deliver out the proper frame rates and things that we're used to in broadcast, be able to deliver that without having impact on what the player is doing. Because, here's one of the things that is interesting when you come into the sports type thing. Generally, we're not taking our cameras or our, actually influencing how the game is played itself. I mean, you could argue, different ways about, okay, does the game need to change so we can tell a story? But in the esports world, like how that frame rate runs, how much GPU, how much is on the CPU of that system, that's going to have a major impact in what that gamer is doing, which is why everybody's watching anyway, and how they're interacting. So it's really important to kind of keep that in mind, because we need the ability to really have that flexibility, even at things that, well, they haven't been around with that standard for so long, because it's not that normal frame rate, and it's not that, in many cases, that normal rectangle that we're used to working with.
There's 3 letters we haven't mentioned yet, which is PTP. I think that...
or HDR, or there are a lot of.
In terms of infrastructure, it seems to me that swapping black and burst for what effectively has to be a whole system for delivering timing, as opposed to just distributing a single signal. There's a lot of benefit to that, but I think where you can avoid it seems to be a good idea. I mean, there have been a few people talking to me about using 2110 and similar things without PTP. I mean, how far do you think you can go without using that, because that would simplify life a little bit.
Anything that doesn't use PTP is simplified. I mean, PTP is quite hard to do right. I don't know,
Well, I didn't see an issue yet.
You haven't seen an issue.
No, seriously. I think implementations come a long way, because people did some strange things in their implementations. But I think the main problem, well, there's not a main problem, but probably I heard some people that want to try to run with NTP instead of PTP.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe it's accurate enough. Well, there are probably a few corner cases with which it's not accurate enough. But to come back to the type of switches and that sort of infrastructure, we have to be aware that yes, it's off the shelf, but it's high grade off the shelf. And PTP implementations in switches, well, you're at a high-end scale. That's for sure. You pay a lot more with PTP aware switches. So you're probably at the 10% of the market instead of the 90 other. Just have to be aware.
And I guess there's also the idea that, I mean, just for the same reason as there's as esports, it's also, there are plenty of computers in broadcasters that may need to get to air. So there isn't really a need to convert them to SDI, and you can't put 2110 in the back of a computer. So that's perhaps another area in broadcast where something like NDI might be beneficial, even if without a SDI infrastructure.
Well, I think the thing we're missing here a little bit is that we're talking about these two things that are completely separate. If your product's got a network connector on the back, then it's got the potential to run any IP standard that there is. So we've seen that with some devices. Some of the products we had were out before NDI, and then the next software update they ran NDI because suddenly they loaded that code. I don't see any problem with a bunch of stuff that's 2110 at the minute. It could be running NDI as well at the same time, and it's just a software switch about what goes over that network connection that it's attached to. There's no reason why we can't run them both simultaneously in lots of bits of hardware. And my feeling is at some point that's where we're going to end up more and more.
Yeah.
The customer can choose on an application basis.
Well, I think that's a really important point. I mean, if we get back into the infrastructure discussion, as we made those changes through the years, when we moved to SD to HD, HD to 3G, 3G now, 4K, UHD, all of that requires a full infrastructure change. The cabling, the connector that goes along with that becomes huge cost that really keeps people into the particular areas that they can't necessarily move. Yeah, it'd be great to have a new production, but the cost becomes so huge. Well, so there's cost to switches, but the thing is, it's agnostic to really what's going across it.
Yeah.
So that really becomes that the future is computers, it's software, it's networks. Okay, the transport mechanism is just what, in many ways, is the flavor of what we have, flavor of the week, flavor of the year, but that can change and evolve over time without having to completely rip everything out and put back in. Yeah, we'll have to have upgrades, but you can do that on a more, you can evolve that as your business grows, as you have those revenue models, as opposed to looking for that huge CapEx where you're completely changing everything over and have all the risks associated.
Yeah.
And that's not just a financial state of mind, but it's also a user state of mind. Because we're used to buy boxes for 10 years or 15 years, they're somewhere in the rack, and then you have a big project and you change, but that's not the case anymore. This changes completely. With software there comes updates, right? And every update you need to check if the program still works.
And hardware. This is the other thing. Most people have never updated their video router, their SDI router. They probably have never upgraded the software since they got it working. With switches, that's changing. With InfoSec policies and with IT, we've got Ethernet switches that we're going to need to upgrade in working systems. And that's something that we haven't been great at doing. We need to plan for that and understand how that's going to work in real life, because otherwise you're opening yourself up to a bunch of IT type security issues with your infrastructure.
Yeah, indeed, and that's true for any IP technology, of course.
Absolutely.
And it's all the more important to have that eye on security. So, is there any comments you want to put forward as we sum up, Will? Because I think we've had a good discussion on how we can use NDI and 2110 together.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's been a great discussion as far as like where the benefits kind of go. I mean, again, just to sum it up, it's the move to IP and ultimately the flexibility that provides for all of our businesses. Where they can exist together is again in I think NDI brings about an ability to innovate and to be very agile in the development. It gives an opportunity for monitoring where, even if you have, for instance, you have two different manufacturers that interoperability, while there's some great standards to work through there, you still have independent companies that are going to interpret things differently just because they're different teams. I mean, it's just the nature of the human element that's in that. Well, what's the way that you get there? I mean, you're going to have to fall back to something else. In this case, I think right now it ends up being uncompressed. Now, that'll develop better over time, but at the moment we're seeing that, even if you have 2110 streams working along, you might want to monitor that, I don't know, on the computer, the laptop that you have jacked into the network in the room across the facility. You can bring that together with NDI quickly and easily without having to then, I mean, there are free tools that allow you to do that today. So these things do work in harmony together, very, 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 very well.
Yeah. Marc?
Well, I think I've come to the conclusion there's room for both formats, standards, whatever you want to call them. We are currently working mostly in islands, but we're seeing the need to connect coming up, and it's certainly something we're building into systems that we're doing. So, the future is IP. It's happening. The whole SDI legacy stuff is going to go away, like it or not, and we're not an industry that likes to be told that kind of stuff, but BNC connectors cost a lot of money to make, and RJ45s and SFPs are used by everybody else. Finally, the IT world's caught up with us, I like to think, in a strange way. So only now, as general purpose IT equipment, computers and networks got to the standard, the quality, the speeds, the quality of service that broadcast and media people need to use it, and now it's our time to sort of nick some of their development cycles and their costs, that are going down. But the writing is on the wall. This is the direction we go. So, again, we're approaching it on the basis of the use case. What's the application? What do you want to do? Why do you want to do it? And how do we develop a flexible infrastructure that works for what you want to do and where you're going? And I guess my thoughts are that's the way to do it. Don't get lost in the technology of the infrastructure as being the important thing. That's something that will come out of the wash as you go on. So keep talking the application.
And I guess with 2110 also adding in a compressed standard within the suite, it just goes to show that it's not an uncompressed world going forward. What are your thoughts?
I think there will be probably a big uptake of that one. There are 2 or 3 vendors I'm aware of that show today something with 2110-22. All those numbers, my God. So there will be a lot of that as well. But I need to come back to the costs. Normally in a slide deck I show the speed of Ethernet, and I think you all know that we started somewhere with 10 megabit at home, and maybe some of you already have 10 gigabit at home. So the speed is going enormously, it's going crazy. So if we talk about switches of 32 ports of 400 gigabit per second, they exist. They're madly expensive today, but they exist. But if you look at the curve, it's not just the SDI curve. We were front runners. We had 27 megabits per second. Now we have 3 gigabit per second with 50p. But anyway, that's not a lot if you look to the IT industry, and they're getting faster, faster, faster. It's incredible. So this means that whatever we do with the video, we will be nothing compared to the IT industry. So the cost will come down tremendously. So yes, there's a wave of IP coming. You cannot escape it, that's for sure. So if there's one thing you can do, it's learn about IP technology. Get your hands dirty, start buying something, just get into it.
Take that first step.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's clear that if we're pragmatic, we can probably deliver more value by mixing the different technologies and making sure that we're actually delivering on what people need and not just following specific protocols, specific technologies. So thank you very much for joining me, Willem, Marc, and Will. And it remains for me to say thank you to you for joining us as well.
Thank you.